On the 9th of September, in the year 862, a Varangian chieftain named Rurik stepped onto the muddy shores of Novgorod, and with that single footfall, he planted the seed of what would become the largest contiguous empire the world had ever witnessed. An empire built not merely on conquest, but on a foundation of blood, autocracy, and an unyielding darkness that would shadow its people for more than a millennium. The lands that would become Russia were not empty when Rurik arrived. Slavic tribes had lived there for centuries, farming the Black Earth, worshipping pagan gods, and governing themselves through assemblies called veches. Yet these disparate peoples lacked unity, and in the chaos of constant tribal warfare and threats from nomadic raiders sweeping across the steppes, they turned to the Varangians, Norse warriors and traders who navigated the river systems connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine world. According to the primary chronicle compiled by monks centuries later, the Slavic tribes issued an invitation that would seal their fate. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Rurik accepted, establishing his seat in Novgorod and founding a dynasty that would rule Russia until the 17th century. But this was no democratic election, no peaceful transition of power. It was the subordination of free peoples to a foreign military elite. The first chapter in Russia's long tragedy of autocratic rule. Rurik's successors moved south, and in 882, Oleg the Prophet seized Kiev, proclaiming it the mother of Russian cities and establishing Kiev and Rus as a formidable power straddling the trade routes between Scandinavia and Byzantium. For 2 centuries, Kiev flourished. Prince Vladimir the Great converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988, binding Russia forever to Byzantine tradition and creating a spiritual infrastructure that would justify Tsarist absolutism for centuries to come. His son Yaroslav the Wise codified laws, built cathedrals, and married his daughters to European kings. Yet beneath this golden veneer lay a fatal weakness, the tradition of dividing the realm among royal sons. This practice transformed unity into fragmentation. Brother turned against brother, and the principalities of Rus descended into endless civil war. Then came the darkness from the east. In the winter of 1237, Mongol armies under Bata Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, swept across the frozen rivers of Russia like a biblical plague. One by one, the cities fell. Ryazan burned after 5 days of resistance, its princes killed, its population slaughtered or enslaved. Vladimir Suzdal and Moscow followed. The Mongols perfected the art of psychological warfare. They built pyramids of skulls, flayed princes alive, and demonstrated to the Russian people that resistance was not merely futile, but suicidal. Kiev, once the jewel of Eastern Europe, fell in December of 1240. The Mongols breached its walls, destroyed the Cathedral of St. Sophia, and reduced the population from 50,000 to fewer than 200 survivors.
Wow.
This context is drawn from the chronicles preserved in the Russian primary chronicle and corroborated by archaeological evidence uncovered throughout the 20th century. The destruction was so complete that when a Franciscan friar visited 6 years later, he found only ruins and bones. The Mongol conquest did not merely devastate Russia militarily, and economically it warped its political soul. For 2.5 centuries, Russian princes would crawl to the Golden Horde in Sarai, kneeling before Mongol khans to receive patents of authority called yarliks. They learned to rule not through consultation or consent, but through terror, tribute, and absolute submission. The veches were crushed, local autonomy died. In its place grew a political culture of Oriental despotism that would define Russia's trajectory for the next 7 centuries. The seed Rurik planted had taken root in poisoned soil. The rise of Moscow was not an accident of geography or divine providence. It was a calculated exercise in collaboration with oppressors, ruthless elimination of rivals, and the systematic construction of an autocratic state that would eventually swallow everything in its path. Moscow began as an insignificant outpost, barely mentioned in chronicles before the 12th century. Yet its princes possessed a talent that would prove more valuable than military might. They understood how to serve the Mongol khans with such obsequious efficiency that they became the horde's preferred tax collectors and enforcers. While other princes chafed under the Mongol yoke, Moscow's rulers embraced it, enriching themselves by extracting tribute from their fellow Russians, and delivering it punctually to Sarai. Ivan I, called Khalida or moneybags, perfected this system in the 14th century. He crushed a rebellion in Tver in 1327, using Mongol troops to devastate a rival Russian principality or Russian prince, commanding Mongol warriors to slaughter Russians. For this service, the Khan rewarded Ivan with the title of Grand Prince and the right to collect tribute from all Russian lands. Ivan used this position to accumulate wealth, purchase territories, and establish Moscow's primacy. He also convinced the Metropolitan of the Orthodox Church to move from Vladimir to Moscow, giving the city spiritual authority to match its political power. The pattern was set. Moscow would grow not by resisting foreign domination, but by perfecting it, then turning those same oppressive mechanisms against its neighbors. By the late 14th century, Mongol power was fragmenting. In 1380, Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy dared to face a Mongol army at Kulikovo Field. Though the victory was temporary, the Mongols returned 2 years. Later in burned Moscow, it shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and planted the idea that the Tatar yoke might someday be thrown off entirely. That moment came under Ivan III, called the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505. Ivan understood that power abhors a vacuum. As the Golden Horde splintered into warring khanates, he stopped paying tribute in 1476, when Khan Ahmad attempted to enforce submission in 1480. Two armies faced each other across the Ugra River, and Ivan refused to fight. After weeks of standoff, Ahmad retreated. The Mongol yoke had ended not with a climactic battle, but with a cold refusal to submit. Ivan now styled himself Tsar, a Russification of Caesar, and married Sophia Paleolog, niece of the last Byzantine emperor. With Constantinople fallen to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Moscow declared itself the Third Rome, the true heir of Christian civilization. This messianic ideology would justify centuries of imperial expansion as a holy mission rather than naked conquest. But Ivan III was merely the architect. His grandson, Ivan IV Ivan, the Terrible, would be the builder of the true autocratic state, and his reign would reveal the full horror of the political system Moscow had created. Crowned in 1547, Ivan was Russia's first officially crowned Tsar. His early reign showed promise. He reformed the law code, created a standing army called the Streltsy, and conquered the Tatar khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, opening the way to Siberian expansion. Yet personal tragedies, paranoid suspicions, and the unlimited power of autocracy transformed him into a monster. In 1565, Ivan divided Russia into 2 administrative zones. The Oprykanina became his personal domain, ruled by the Oprykanika black-robed horsemen carrying brooms and dog-heads as symbols of their mission to sweep away treason and gnaw the Tsar's enemies. What followed was a reign of terror that prefigured Stalin's purges for centuries. The entire families were executed on mere suspicion. Novgorod, suspected of treason, was systematically destroyed in 1570. Historians estimate between 15,000 and 60,000 people were massacred over 5 weeks. Ivan had shown what Russian autocracy could become when unrestrained by law, custom, or conscience. When Ivan the Terrible died in 1508, possibly after murdering his own son and heir in a fit of rage, 3 years earlier Russia stood on the precipice of a catastrophe that would nearly erase it from existence. Ivan's surviving son Fyodor I was pious but weak, and real power fell to Boris Godunov, a boyar who had risen through court intrigue. When Fyodor's younger brother Dmitry died under mysterious circumstances in 1590, one officially an accident during an epileptic seizure, unofficially perhaps murdered on Godunov's orders, the direct line of Rurik's dynasty faced extinction. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the Zemsky Sober, a consultative assembly, elected Godunov as Tsar, breaking the ancient bloodline that had ruled for 7 centuries. Russia's boyars never fully accepted Godunov's legitimacy, and when famine struck from 1600 to 1603, killing perhaps 2 million people, roughly 1/3 of Russia's population, it seemed like divine judgment, according to historian Chester Dunning's research on this period. The famine resulted from volcanic eruptions in Peru that caused global cooling, but to Russians, it appeared as cosmic retribution for breaking the sacred chain of legitimate succession. In 1603, a man appeared in Poland, claiming to be Dmitri, Ivan's supposedly dead son. Whether he was Gregory Otropiv, a defrocked monk, or genuinely believed himself the murdered prince, remains debated. What matters is that Poland and disaffected Russian Bojars supported him, seeing an opportunity to weaken Godunov and expand Polish influence. When Boris Godunov suddenly died in 1605, false Dmitri marched into Moscow and claimed the throne. His reign lasted less than a year. In May of 1606, a Bojar uprising murdered him, reportedly burning his body and firing his ashes from a cannon toward Poland to prevent his unclean spirit from haunting Russia. But this was merely the beginning of Russia's time of troubles, not its end. For the next 7 years, Russia descended into chaos unprecedented in its history. Multiple pretenders claimed the throne, each supported by different factions. Second false Dmitri appeared, then a third. Poland invaded, capturing Moscow in 1610 and installing a Polish garrison in the Kremlin. Sweden seized Novgorod. Cossacks and peasant armies roamed the countryside, pillaging indiscriminately. The state ceased to function. Famine returned. It seemed entirely possible that Russia would simply disintegrate, its territories absorbed by Poland, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire. Salvation came from an unexpected source, not the Bojars or the church hierarchy, but a butcher from Nizhny Novgorod named Kuzma Minin, who convinced a local noble, Prince Dmitry Pozarsky, to lead a national militia to liberate Moscow. Their army, funded by donations from merchants and townspeople, marched to the capital and, after fierce fighting, expelled the Polish garrison in October of 1612. In 1613, a new Zemsky Sober convened to elect a czar who could unite the fractured nation. They chose 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov, whose main qualification was being distantly related to Ivan the Terrible's first wife, and therefore possessing a tenuous link to the ancient dynasty. In Balka Wesa, I'm so uncouple alas manesa with of some servana floss of subsandoas of a bite of sunai on spell what we side so basantra abscansas I was society on saw with the grow what six simon some so tops. Mikhail was crowned in the Kremlin's Assumption Cathedral, founding a dynasty that would rule Russia for 304 years until revolution would finally destroy it. The Romanovs inherited a devastated realm. The population had declined by perhaps 1/3. Agriculture was ruined. The treasury was empty. Western border territories had been ceded to Poland and Sweden, yet from this nadir, Russia would slowly rebuild, and under the Romanovs it would expand into a great power that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. But the political system remained fundamentally unchanged. Autocracy, justified by the trauma of the time of troubles. Russians had learned that chaos was worse than tyranny, that disorder was more terrifying than oppression. This lesson would be invoked by every subsequent czar to justify absolute power. The Romanov era had begun. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed Russia's transformation from a backward, landlocked realm into a European great power. But this metamorphosis was achieved not through gradual evolution or willing participation, but through state violence on a scale that crushed millions beneath the machinery of imperial ambition. The first Romanov Tsars focused on consolidation and recovery. They reclaimed some lost territories, codified serfdom through the law code of 1649 legally binding, peasants to the land in a form of slavery that would last until 1861, and expanded eastward into Siberia. Russian Cossacks reached the Pacific Ocean by 1647, giving Russia its vast Asian empire. This expansion was presented as civilizing mission, but for the indigenous peoples Yakuts, Chukchi Evenksi, and dozens of others, it meant subjugation, forced tribute and furs, epidemics, and cultural destruction. Then came Peter the First, Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, or was a giant in both stature and ambition, standing nearly 6 feet 8 inches tall, in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. He traveled to Western Europe incognito, working in shipyards to learn naval construction, and returned to Russia determined to drag his nation into modernity by its hair. Peter's reforms touched everything. He forced nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothing. Enforcers stood at Moscow's gates with shears to physically cut the beards off those who refused. He created Russia's first modern army and navy through forced conscription that took men from their villages for 25 years of service. He built St. Petersburg on the bones of perhaps 30,000 to 100,000 workers who died in the marshes constructing his window to Europe. Most catastrophically, Peter intensified serfdom to fund his military and construction projects. Peasants became property, bought and sold separately from land, used as gambling stakes, given as gifts. Russian serfdom in Peter's era more closely resembled American plantation slavery than European feudalism. The state's appetite for resources was insatiable. Taxes increased 5-fold during Peter's reign. And when peasants could not pay in money, they paid in labor, in conscripted sons, in their very bodies. Peter defeated Sweden in the Great Northern War, which lasted from 1700 to 1721, and secured Russia's Baltic territories. He proclaimed Russia an empire in 1721, and himself its emperor. Yet his greatest legacy was not territorial, but institutional. He had created a thoroughly militarized police state where all estates, nobles, clergy, merchants, peasants existed to serve the autocracy's purposes. The pattern continued under his successors. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, corresponded with Voltaire and collected Enlightenment philosophy, yet crushed Pugachev's rebellion of 1773 to 1775 with exemplary brutality. Yemilian Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, led an uprising that attracted hundreds of thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and religious dissenters. For 2 years they controlled vast territories and threatened the entire structure of serfdom. When Catherine's forces finally captured Pugachev, he was brought to Moscow in an iron cage and publicly executed, beheaded, and quartered on January 21, 1775. Catherine expanded Russia's borders dramatically, annexing Crimea and most of Poland. Yet internally, serfdom intensified. By 1800, approximately 57% of Russia's population consisted of serfs, human property of either private landowners or the state itself. This historical context is extensively documented in Richard Pipes' seminal work, Russia under the Old Regime, which demonstrates how thoroughly the autocratic state dominated every aspect of Russian life. Russia had become a great power, but its greatness rested on a foundation of mass bondage. The question was not whether this system would collapse, but when and how violently. The seeds of revolution were already germinating in the frozen soil. The 19th century dawned with Russia triumphant. Napoleon's Grand Army lay frozen in the snow, and Russian troops marched into Paris in 1814 as liberators of Europe. Yet this military glory concealed a society ossified, repressive, and incapable of adapting to the modern world without catastrophic upheaval. Alexander I, the victor over Napoleon, flirted briefly with liberal reforms but ultimately preserved autocracy and serfdom intact. His successor Nicholas I, who ruled from 1825 to 1855, created a police state of such thoroughness that Russia became known as the gendarme of Europe. The third section, his secret police, monitored intellectuals, censored publications, and crushed any hint of dissent. When revolution swept Europe in 1848, Nicholas sent Russian troops to crush Hungarian independence, demonstrating his commitment to absolute monarchy. Yet Nicholas's system proved brittle when tested. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 exposed Russia's backwardness catastrophically. British and French forces using rifled weapons and railways defeated. Russian army still relying on serf conscripts and pre-industrial logistics. Russia lost on its own soil, and the humiliation finally forced reform. Alexander II, ascending in 1855, understood that serfdom had to not from humanitarian impulse, but because Russia could not compete militarily or economically, while half its population remained enslaved. On March the 3rd, 1861, he issued the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing approximately 23 million serfs. But emancipation was not liberation. Peasants received inadequate land allotments, burdened with redemption payments that would last 49 years. Village communes controlled the land collectively, restricting individual freedom. Former serfs often found themselves worse off economically than before. Meanwhile, the autocracy remained absolute. Alexander granted no constitution, no parliament, no civil liberties. Frustrated radicals turned to terrorism. In 1881, after multiple failed attempts, revolutionaries from the People's Will Organization assassinated Alexander II with bombs on a St. Petersburg street. The Star Liberator died in a pool of his own blood, and with him died any remaining hope for gradual reform from above. His son, Alexander III, reversed liberalizing trends and intensified repression. His son, Nicholas II, inherited the throne in 1894 and would be Russia's last Tsar, though he could not have known it. Nicholas was personally decent, but politically incompetent, utterly convinced of his divine mandate to preserve autocracy intact and holy, unprepared for the forces gathering against him. Industrialization came rapidly to Russia in the late 19th century, creating an urban working class concentrated in terrible conditions, perfect fuel for revolutionary movements. Marxist ideas spread among intellectuals. Social revolutionary and social democratic parties formed underground, dreaming of revolution. Then came two catastrophes that shattered the regime's legitimacy forever. First, on January the 22nd, 1905, bloody Sunday troops fired on peaceful workers petitioning the Tsar in St. Petersburg, killing hundreds. The massacre triggered the 1905 revolution, forcing Nicholas to grant a constitution and create the Duma, Russia's first parliament. Yet he systematically undermined these concessions, dissolving Dumas that displeased him and maintaining autocratic power through manipulation and force. Second, and most catastrophically, Nicholas led Russia into the First World War in 1914. By 1917, after 3 years of devastating defeats, millions of casualties, economic collapse, and bread shortages in the cities, the entire system simply disintegrated. In February 1917, bread riots in Petrograd escalated into revolution when troops refused to fire on crowds and instead joined them. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicated, ending the Romanov dynasty and 3 centuries of absolute rule. 8 months later, the Bolsheviks seized power, promising peace, land, and bread, but delivering instead a different form of tyranny, one that would kill millions more and prove that Russia's tragedy had not ended, but merely entered a new and even darker chapter.